Zoom.
Resume. Yes,
There
I
we
paused
go.
it. So, good afternoon or good morning, where our guest is from. Good morning. Welcome to IDC's webinar on inclusive leadership by Miss Melissa Castro. And so she's going to take you through some great information on how to foster psychological safety within your workplace. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Shantae. I'm so excited to be back with this group. I had the honor of presenting to what was formerly the Society for Diversity last year, now our Institute for Diversity Certification. And I'm not going to lie, we had a little bit of a psychological safety party the last time we brought this topic to the table. And it will look a little different today because we are in webinar format. And it is only 10 a.m. where I'm calling in from, about an hour northeast of Seattle, Washington. So, a calibrated party mode. But thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing this space with me and for coming to talk about psychological safety during a time where I think we can all agree we would love to see more of it. We want to build more of it. And you all are here doing that work and trying to make that a reality. So grateful to have you here. The chat is live and open, so I would love for you to engage in the chat. And to start off, please throw out where you're calling from, if you would be so kind. I'd love to hear where you're calling from in the world, and throw your time zone in there or your region. Would love to hear that. And we will get rolling here into our topic. And I'm also going to make sure that my chat is where I need it to be. Riverside, Cincinnati, Boston. We've got Iowa, North Carolina, Cincinnati, Syracuse, Delaware. Wow, thank you. Chicagoland, Colorado. Wow, we've got the states covered here. We've got some East Coasters, some West Coasters, some Midwesters. Thank you so much, everybody. We've
We
got
even got
Jersey in the
we got
house.
a Germany person from
Oh,
Germany.
wow. I missed
Nice.
Germany, 7 p.m. Thank you so
DJ.
much for
Uh-huh.
sharing that. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Wow. And I love to just hear where folks are coming from in this group because this really is a global community. And I think that rang true last time talking about psychological safety. So another Washington State. Thanks for being here, Raul. Appreciate that. And yeah, good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody. Okay, so let's see here. We click this back. We're going forward now. So I'm Melissa Castro. Thank you again to those who were here for part of our early dipping in behind the scenes. But to start us formally, I am a leadership and team development coach. I specialize in positive intelligence, psychological safety, and energy leadership. And I'm also a certified diversity professional. I'm a few years into my membership with this group. And I'm so grateful to be part of it and be sharing in this connection and learning around psych safety with you. My firsthand experience, my study of leadership, my experimentation with leadership has really taught me one clear thing. And that's if we all see ourselves as leaders, we take accountability for our leadership influence, regardless of our title, regardless of our place. We use our leadership influence, and that's how we create and lead inclusive, high-performing teams that can and do drive really transformative change in big and small ways, both in their workplaces, in their communities, in their homes. When we act and walk like leaders that honor our unique intrinsic gifts that we have, we honor our influence that we have, that we bring to the table, we are having a circle of influence around us, and we can create the positive change, the change we want to see. And on the flip side of that, what I often see with my clients and with groups I work with in terms of psychological safety, fear, doubt, external pressures, things that are out there that detract from psychological safety, cloud our potential. They prevent us from showing up as leaders. They prevent us from showing up with agency over co-creating our own spaces. And so my aim with clients really is to give back that agency, to help people lead from within. And doesn't matter if you're a people manager or not. And so we're influencers by choice or default. Psychological safety, I think, is one of the vehicles, the mechanisms, the unlocks that help us leverage that leadership, influence, leverage, and use those gifts and create the environments that we want to be part of, that we want to bring our full selves into, where we can speak openly, where we can share, and where we can maintain connection and integrity, even through tension and conflict, and we can support and empower others to do the same. So that's where I'm coming from, and here's where we're going and what we'll endeavor toward today. We're, of course, going to talk about psychological safety and inclusive leadership. We will explore the concept. We'll talk about why and how it contributes to creating inclusive and high-performing teams. We will also look at some practical strategies, some tools, and I would love to hear shares in the chat. I will prompt you all a couple times to say, you know, what else do you think? What would you add here? What's coming up for you? I do think sharing is caring in these spaces, and this is a learning space. And so please do engage in the way that is best in service to you and to the community here. And last but not least, we'll close out with a little self-reflection, some interactive application. I am a coach by trade, and so you can bet that there's going to be some reflection activities in here where you all can take these away, journal them out, and just give some thought to maybe something that you're bringing to the space or wanting to take out of it. And the headliner, short version, spoiler alert for this presentation, even if you check out right now and you head out the door, I want you to hear one thing loud and clear, and I would love for you to take this with you, and it's that inclusive leadership starts with you, and it starts with all of us. Co-creating psychological safety is the us piece. Inclusive leadership is the you piece. We bring those things together, and this process really does begin from within, an inside job that we bring outside to do the connection work. And so that's where we're going to be going. That's the framing of this conversation, and that's the overall takeaway here. And the why behind that is because it's a universal experience to feel or not feel belonging when we're working together in groups. And inclusion being the common goal that we're working toward, we can endeavor to do that, but it has to be on purpose and with intention and with some strategies and probably hopefully some levity, some laughing, and some ways to bring some more sustainability, I would say, and a little bit of fun to this work, because it can be long and hard and difficult. But I do endeavor to make it a space where we can have some engagement in a way that is generative and hopefully energizing and not draining. And so all that being said, please, if you would be so kind, share what comes to mind when you hear the word psychological safety, the phrase psychological safety, the concept. What word or emoji comes to mind for you, if you'd pop that into the chat? Courage. Thank you for that. What comes to mind for folks? Comfort, authentic. I'm going to check out my emoji options here. Freedom, trust, constructive, conflict. Yeah. Freedom from fear. Several words. That's okay. We're here for it. Share differing opinions. Yes. Authenticity, welcoming and comfort, security, protection, freedom to make mistakes. Couple different freedom lenses here. Equity. Yes, 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 yes. Thank you. I love that everyone went for words rather than emojis. That tells me something about the audience. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Belonging. Yep. Open and safe. Thank you all. Thank you for sharing those words. And, you know, everybody comes to psychological safety work with some different perspectives in mind, different bias, different good experiences, bad experiences, all the things that have led us up to the point we're at. But the reality is we've all experienced psychological safety, and we've also experienced the lack of psychological safety. And this is that pivot moment where we're in a meeting, we're with our team, we want to raise our hand, we want to ask a question, we go to do it, and We decide, should I? Should I not? Should I hold back? Is now the time? We do all these calculations. We experience or don't experience psychological safety when we make the choice to share something hard, share hard feedback, ask for something that's hard to ask for. So asking for feedback, asking for support, asking for some kind of change. And when we talk about inclusion, we also know that the moment that we step up to the psychological safety podium, if you will, is that in that moment, all of our experiences, biases that we carry or that others carry, power dynamics, intersectional identity, and personal narratives that go with all of that shape our decision of how we experience psychological safety when we stand at that pivot point. And so it's a really visceral human experience when we think about it. We take the academia and the academic, definition out of it. We don't want to feel bad. We don't want to look bad. We don't want to do something that is inherently uncomfortable, risky, vulnerable, because we want to maintain connection, not risk losing it. We want to belong. We want to be valued. We want to build our relationships. And so this is why psychological safety is such a universal concept, that even though we don't necessarily call it that, it is something that we can relate to, that moment of hesitation and opportunity to either step up or not. And it's not that it's our fault whether we do or don't necessarily, but there's just a lot coming to the table with us as we make that choice, and a lot goes into that moment for us. And I have a question in the chat. I'm happy to take them along the way here. Do you think our identities impact how we model and promote psychological safety as leaders? Absolutely. I can't think of anything that our identities don't impact in our leadership practice, and certainly in all realms of life, but from a leadership influence perspective, absolutely. We make the choice to model psychological safety, to be part of it, and to co-create it. And that's what we're going to get into, is these strategies for kind of the big frameworks for how and what we can do. But it does come back to that inside job, as starting from ourselves as leaders. And so we'll dig back into that. And please come back around to this question with me if you feel like we're not getting a clean, clear, crisp answer and solution for that. But yes, absolutely, our identities shape our leadership influence, and how aware of them we are and how we wield them is part of that. And so stepping back from that visceral, that human moment, that emotional part of psychological safety, let's talk about the definition and get back into the more research-based academic piece of psychological safety. I work with the framework that Amy Edmondson authored. She's a researcher, and she's one of the best known names in psychological safety. She wrote a book called The Fearless Organization, and here's her definition of what psychological safety is. So the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, mistakes, and that the team, or a space with other humans, a shared space, the shared space is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. And so there are different schools of thought. There are different proponents, opponents, ideas about psychological safety. The one that I work off of most commonly, that I work with my groups on and my team leaders on, is this fearless organization framing for it. And, there's another top thought leader up there, Timothy Clark. He calls psychological safety a culture of rewarded vulnerability. And he has a different lens and framework and toolkit that is out there that some people really gravitate towards. So I'll be sharing Amy Edmondson's today, and welcome and appreciate any questions or thoughts about it. We'll get into a little bit of what that assessment process looks like. But now we have our working definition, our shared vernacular. So let's clarify a couple other pieces of psychological safety. This often gets a little bit mixed up, the difference between trust and psychological safety. And they are two sides of the same coin. They need to go together, but they are slightly different. So trust is, will we give someone else the benefit of the doubt when you take a risk? Will you trust how they will hold your information or receive your information? And psychological safety, again, is that we step up to the tippy top of that podium or that diving board or whatever you want to call that space? And will you give others the benefit of the doubt when you take a risk? Do you feel like you will be received by the group in a way that is productive, supportive, encouraging, empowering, particularly while you're taking a risk? And so a couple misconceptions here. Trust and psychological safety have to go together. And here's a couple more pieces of that, because psychological safety is about interpersonal and relational risk. So being in community with other humans is what I'm talking about when I say relational risk. Being in a shared space with somebody else on your team or elsewhere out in the world. It's not about physical safety. Psychological safety, physical safety, they can go together, but what we're talking about is that specific interpersonal and relational risk in terms of the workplace and being on teams with others. Psychological safety is also not the right to comfort and not about just feeling good and everyone's sunshine and rainbows and unicorns around the workplace, because that's not realistic. That's not going to happen in a shared space with humans. It's more like bumper cars, and the ability to accept the friction, the bumper car action that will happen in our shared spaces, and creating that safety, that trust, that communication, and that learning environment where we're willing to be candid and we're willing to be open and we're willing to have real conversations. And that doesn't always mean that you feel good. And I wish I could tell you I found the secret solution to make somebody feel like they can just, go forward and have tough conversations that aren't uncomfortable. But if you are getting uncomfortable and having conversations, you're probably doing the vulnerability thing right. And so psychological safety doesn't magic wand that away, unfortunately. And let me see here. We've got some chat cooking here. Thank you for addressing the difference between psychological safety and trust. Yes, thank you for putting that in there. It's a big one, and I don't think we talk about that a whole lot when we talk about psychological safety. Super related, but psychological safety, as we will talk about a little bit later on, is really, there's a lot that comes to our formations about our ideas of how we engage in psychological safety. And if we add the layers of and complexity of how we think about trust and all of our experiences and biases and things that we use as our trust mechanisms, do we trust this or not? Then we get to a big ocean to boil when we talk about those two things all as one lump. So just separating them out a little bit can make a difference. Okay, just checking our time here. Psychological safety and the evolution of DEIB. Now, forgive me, we all use different acronyms at this point. Whatever your acronym is for equity, inclusion, belonging work, diversity work, please feel free to mentally put it in there for my DEIB. But really what I'm talking about here is we know that psychological safety is part of all things DEIB, all things equity, all things inclusion. Why? Because it's creating an open environment where we can bring our different identities to the table without fear of negative consequences. That's what psychological safety is. We also know that psychological safety spaces that have it facilitate openness, learning conversations, collaboration, dialogue. And that means that when we have diverse perspectives coming to the table from all lenses, race, gender, ethnicity, political beliefs, role in the organization, power dynamics, hierarchy, all of these things that come to play, we bring these diverse perspectives to the table, and psychological safety is what allows them to contribute meaningfully, what allows them to take risks if they're a new or different lens or perspective. We need psychological safety to have inclusive spaces. So that's a given. That's usually something that most DEIB leaders can at some level agree with, or at least understand from that perspective. And here's the other piece of it. DEI is evolving, and it needs to evolve, because as we experience it, as we know it, as we've seen it over the last few years, at least I can speak in the United States. I know we have folks from elsewhere, so I'd love to hear your perspective too, Germany in the house here, or others. But DEI in the States is under a change-up period. Some folks are out there from a legal standpoint trying to blow up some of these initiatives. and DEI leaders are trying to glow it up. And by that, here's what I mean. We are talking about DEI in a different way, and we are needing to find connecting mechanisms, bridging conversations, common interest points that fit across identity, across lenses that are not just about race, that are not just about gender, that are not just about age, but we are needing to find ways to open this conversation about creating shared spaces where we feel like we can show up. And this is what's giving me some hope, is that psychological safety is known to be a universal framework. It is a conversation opener because it's a universal human experience. It's something we can all relate to, and therefore it's something we can all build together. And so two great thought leaders that have mentioned elements of this. Kenji Yoshino is a DEI thought leader in the legal industry. And in a conversation where he was talking about strengthening DEI in the new legal landscape, where DEI initiatives are being challenged in court, he talks about how we can shift to this universal strategic framework focus that is about upskilling leaders, and that we take inclusive leadership as a given. And that's definitely a trend that I can attest to and speak from, at least from my millennial perspective. Most millennial leaders that I work with take inclusion, take equity, take belonging at face value as something that is necessary to innovation, to growth, to high performance. And so it's kind of like a yes, and we need that. How do we keep building on it? And so, psychological safety has not been challenged in court, and it would be hard to do so. So thinking about this with a little bit of a flip lens of, yeah, there's a lot of hard stuff going on in DEI, and I don't want to dismiss that. Like, there's a lot of slog, there's a lot of mud, there's a lot of time, energy, effort that has been going into this work, and in some ways it's getting harder in some spaces. But if we take a more universalist approach, John A. Powell's another thinker in this space who talks about this, we're really focusing on a common end goal, and we're doing whatever we can with whatever means we have access to bridge toward that shared goal. And so we can use this as a conversation starter, a conversation opener. And back to that leadership influence piece, we can use it as a tool that creates agency, because psychological safety is not something that is just created by the top leader at the, at the top of the hierarchy in an organization. It is something that starts as an inside job and comes out to the collective, and we're all responsible and accountable to it. So we're going to start back with that inside job piece and talk a little bit about what I mean by that. Why I bring this up with people is because it doesn't matter where you are on your equity journey. It doesn't matter what you do or don't do in DEIB work. It doesn't matter what your title is or what your tasks are at work in your day-to-day. Psychological safety begins with self-awareness, because it's about bridging the gap between the environment that we want to create and be part of and showing up in a way that influences us in that direction. And so let me click you through here. Noticing our intention versus our impact is huge. It's part of checking our narrative. It's part of being aware and open to feedback. And from a power dynamic perspective, we need to understand that title, hierarchy, and things in the workplace do shift how psychological safety is given, received, influenced. But it looks different at different levels. People have different priorities. People have different experiences that led them to this place. And this is why also checking our own personal narratives, being responsible and accountable to all of our experience that has led us to our inflections and our thoughts and our posture around creating psychological safety. We need to know the story that we're telling ourselves. And we need to check that and see where it aligns, where it doesn't align, and where we can build, again, toward that common direction, that shared goal. And so a reflection question for you all, as promised, really just thinking about, are we aware of our intent and our impact? And are we taking ownership of our leadership influence? And so my question here is, what narratives shape your leadership view, your influence, and your impact? And I'll give you a moment with that as I just, it's a hypothetical. You don't have to put it in the chat unless you want to, but I'd love to see what we've got here. thank you so much. You are so kind and supportive in the chat. Thank you for that. Thank you on the breakdown of differences. I appreciate it. And so now we're going to take this inside narrative out for a spin into the world with the other humans, co-creating cultures of psychological safety. So at a high level, if there was a crispy clear recipe for baking psychological safety, this would be it. About as clear and crisp as we can get it from a broad perspective, because again, it's going to get different when we go into the micro level within our teams and organizations and industry contexts and identity contexts, all these layers. So here are the 4 buckets. Open dialogue, which fosters trust. Here's our trust again. Recognizing and appreciating diverse perspectives and accepting the given that diverse perspectives, and I mean this with a very intentionally broad term, diverse perspectives, they make our innovation stronger, faster, smarter, because we have different things coming to the table to unify us toward a common goal. So creativity and innovation are a huge piece of that. Implementing feedback. This is another big one. And not just one-way feedback where it's top down. Inclusive leaders need to think about feedback as a two-way street of conversation, an ongoing conversation. The old ways of feedback did not work for many people, often still do not work. Most leaders do not have great feedback skills, and they have even worse feedback receiving skills. So feedback giving and receiving is a good area of practice and growth for most leaders most of the time. We could always do a little better with that. And part of it is creating more of a dialogue space. And then developing clear guidelines and support systems to ensure a safe and inclusive environment. Now, I know these sound like, okay, these make sense. Like I can see how that would be important, but they are hard to create and they are hard to measure. They're hard to manage. We'll get to that in a second. And it can get a little murky because we all might be trying to bake the same thing, but we do have a little bit of a different flavor. We have different ingredients. We have different cooking styles, and that's all okay and to be expected. But these are the big buckets and ingredients that we would want to bring to our cook-off, so to speak. And we're going to kind of click down into how we can think about that from a more tactical and tangible perspective and where we can measure it and all that good stuff. So here's another Amy Edmondson tool that is within that Fearless Organization book. It's called the Leader's Toolkit. And these are all the steps that at a high level, if we were baking that psychological safety cake that I just showed you, it's full of layers. And we do have some best practices, tips and tricks for moving in that direction. And this is a lot, but I want to draw out a couple of big pieces here. With this toolkit, we are really stopping, pausing for reflection, inviting curiosity, and taking a learning posture. And we're going to talk about this some more as we keep drilling down into these practical strategies. But really, this is a toolkit that is called the Leader's Toolkit for a reason. It's not the manager's toolkit. It is something that anybody at all levels can use in their connection building with their colleagues or their direct reports or even their friends. I would put that out there. Family. And the reason I say this is because we're back to that leadership influence. You don't have to be a manager to be able to talk about some shared expectations and shared meaning around a goal that you have in a shared space with another person. You don't need to be a manager to invite participation, to practice thoughtful inquiry and empathy, to be a good listener. And in terms of these forums for input and guidelines for discussion, that might be a little bit more tactical for the workplace. But, you know, this comes with boundaries, and that's an area of work where many leaders could use some tips and tricks and some practice. And so creating structures, creating processes, creating a two-way street for feedback, like I was talking about, inviting participation, not just dictating what participation should look like, are different ways to think about this. And then, of course, responding productively is another piece. And these are all with the effort, intention, endeavor toward creating more inclusive spaces, creating psychological safety, and inviting people to be part of co-creating that culture, not just from the management level, but from all levels. Keep the questions coming if you got them. I think our chat is quiet for now. Practical strategies. So this is just another way to look at this leader's toolkit. And again, there's a couple of things that keep coming up in here. And I'm curious what you all see, if you'd be willing to share. Like, what are some through lines you're seeing as we talk through these strategies, or that you use as your own strategies for building inclusive leadership practices, psychologically safe spaces? I really welcome you to share anything that's coming up for you. And I'll offer again here that there's some common threads for me, which are inquiry, learning posture, respect, checking our narratives and assumptions, supporting vulnerability by sharing our own, asking questions, reflecting, learning. So again, we are bringing this loop and thinking about how this is an inside job that comes outside. And it does start with ourselves first, because we have to be curious in order to engage in these conversations. We have to be thoughtful and good listeners to engage in these. And so they're reflective strategies, inquiry-based strategies, learning-based strategies. And I also can understand and appreciate most folks will look at this and say, all sounds great, makes sense, would love to see it. How do we build it? How do we do it? You can't just show up and ask questions all the time and then magically psychological safety comes up. This is true. And what I can offer to you, what I have seen work well, is putting a little data in the mix. It can be a big help, because if you all have heard the saying, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's a Peter Drucker organizational change consultant quote. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And I don't know if anybody here has sat at a table with your peers or your direct reports or your team, and somebody just, I don't know, rips off the Band-Aid and says, hey, how do we build psychological safety? Let's go for it. Let's build some psychological safety together. It would be an interesting reception we'd probably get, unless we were in the safe space. This may be the only safe space where you all are like, yeah, roll up the sleeves, let's talk about it. But we really do need some framing and some structure for folks to be able to think about how they all co-create cultures of psychological safety. And so what I use is the Fearless Organization Assessment, Psychological Safety Index Assessment, or the PSI. And we use this scan and survey to create conversation around these that happens in a structured way with a facilitator. And I show up as a coach. I bring up these different topic areas, and I help teams dig into what would otherwise go undiscussed. And these are the 4 domains, and this is kind of how the assessment runs. So they take a 7 survey questionnaire about these different categories, and they measure how people think about willingness to help, if they can give and receive support on this team, that people are honored for their best intentions. It talks about inclusion and diversity. How do people feel if they're bringing different identities, experiences, perspectives to the table, and are those welcome? Attitude to risk and failure is a big one. We talked about psychological safety being all about the willingness to take interpersonal risk. And so the team's posture and how they think about failure or mistakes or errors or whatever you want to call them, misses is one that another team had. How does the team think about it? What do they do when there's failure? Are we shaping it in a direction where there can be risk and we are expected to fail because that's the only way we learn or grow or adapt? And then lastly, we talk very broadly about open conversation. And this cracks open different things for every different team, because really at the crux here is, are members of this team able to bring up and discuss tough issues with each other? And I don't have a poll for this, though I should probably create one at some point. And it's, how often are people willing to bring up tough issues? It's not that often. And when we do, we try our best, and good intentions are sometimes not going to match our impact. of trying to have an open conversation. And so this is always an area of growth for teams. What does open conversation look like? What does it look like to bring up tough issues as a team? And how do we set the expectation that a little bit of conflict, a little bit of tension, a little bit of discomfort, and the bumper cars situation is normal and is expected? We couldn't operate in shared human spaces without it. And we certainly couldn't be high performing, inclusive teams without a willingness to accept some discomfort in the natural, normal tension that's going to happen in creativity and innovation and high performance and in inclusion conversations for that matter. And so the other thing that this PSI does for folks is we discuss what is going well and why it's going well. So we help people distill what's working and, what's really, cooking well for their team and what could be better and how do they want to build in that direction. So the trick here is, it's not really a trick, but we're inviting everyone to the structured conversation where they all have a part. People don't get to opt out because you're part of the team. You have influence. You are co-creating psychological safety just as much as your boss is, just as much as your peer is on that team in your shared space. I think we got a little chat here. Let's see what we got. Inclusive language. Thanking employees for feedback every time to demonstrate feedback is welcome. Avoiding using the word but. Yeah, I love that. And is always a great word to put in place of using the word but. Yes, and. What is the language that Edmondson uses to describe the difference between failure and error? Ooh, it's a great question. She addresses when errors are made because people didn't follow procedures versus experience following a plan and that the desired outcome was not, or the outcome was not as desired. That's a great question. I know what you're talking about because she does have a whole category and discussion about changing our lens on failure. And one thing I would say to that is I'll have to go back to that and check it out. And I think how people talk about failure is really a situational and industry specific thing, because how engineers talk about failure, how accountants talk about failure, how executive support professionals, hospitality professionals talk about error is different. And so this actually brings me to this next piece, which is planning your team's psychological safety party. Really getting to the crux of what is important for your folks and how they want to hold each other accountable to that, how they want to talk about failure, how does that work in an area in context of their industry, of their tasks, of their relationships, of the needs of their role. And really what happens with psychological safety conversations, the natural tendency for pretty much every team I've ever done this assessment for is one thing. They point to the external influencers, the out there, the company, the leaders over there, senior management, all these other people that, yes, may well be contributing to a lack of psychological safety in this broader organizational system. And what I bring our teams back to is we need to co-create psychological safety at the team level. And so an organization can have a policy of psychological safety. That doesn't necessarily mean it translates to anybody across the org, or it may hit for some teams and not for others. And this is why we really have to talk at the team level, people that have shared accountability and that share spaces to get their work done. So when we have this opportunity to party plan, if you will, together, we co-create those things and we don't have to mandate policies or expectations that don't resonate with our group. Our group has to co-create what we want to see. And so we use this as a relationship building tool, like with the assessment. We create some shared meaning, some shared vernacular around very different experiences. We acknowledge that we all have narratives of bias, that we have different expectations, experiences, perspectives, and that's a given. We bring that to the table. We accept that is what it is, and we want to be aware of it and shift it if it's not serving us or our people that we're trying to hold space for. And being open to not fully understanding or, completely really experiencing or being able to relate to the experience that others have, but still being able to hold space for them and be active listeners. And that helps us build these authentic connections. And so, as you can see, again, really big categories, but we need to get down to this micro team level because this is going to mean something different for every single person that puts eyes on it, or that thinks about it, or that reflects on it, or that wants to build it. And so we have to invite everyone that is a piece of the party, because if we start talking about uninvited party guests, hypothetical party situations, we are not going to be able to create anything meaningful and clear for our team to endeavor toward and to be able to work toward this shared common outcome. Because if we don't know what it is, it's kind of that, if you don't know who you are and what you're about, how does anybody else know? And that same thing goes for thinking about psychological safety as a team and as a group. And we can tackle it from the bigger organizational level, but it's going to still take some separate work where we're looking at it from different layers and contexts. And so pulling us back up to the broad from the more, team level, here are some big buckets of things we can think about from an organizational perspective and not just our team of interdependencies. In the fearless organization, we really have to be looking at zones of growth. And the learning zone is the one that offers the perspective of psychological safety, the feeling of psychological safety, the co-creation and adaptation of psychological safety. Because in the learning zone, this is where inquiry and flow is expected and normalized. And this is what we do to move things forward. This is where tension is acknowledged and it happens, but we still collaborate openly. In the comfort zone, we have the politeness breakdown. And as I talked about previously, some folks do mistake psychological safety for right to comfort or ease. And so a lot of teams will have these very high levels on an assessment, and yet nobody is willing to have a conversation about them. Or, everything is fine, but there's no real team collaboration. So it's a surface level. We sit in comfort. We don't want to shake things up. And this does happen sometimes with folks. And this is why it comes back to that inside job, because if people aren't willing to accept and explore in how they are showing up in this politeness loop of just not really giving meaningful feedback, not really receiving it, not really asking hard questions, not really receiving hard questions, we can stay in that comfort zone. And that's a cozy place for many of us. Humans typically prefer comfort over discomfort. So it's a normal place for teams to be. It's when psychological safety and the idea of it might be high, but performance accountability and the challenge from a leadership perspective is not giving people agency and enrollment in the process. And then these other two zones, we all know what the apathy zone looks like. It's disengaged, it's disconnected, it's go along to get along. It might be, checking the bare minimum boxes and not doing anything else. And it can work. But when we're talking about zone of high performance, zone of growth, zone of inclusion, it's in that learning zone with all this inquiry and flow coming from curiosity, coming from willingness to learn, and coming from that acceptance that, again, we have to fail and stumble and bumper car crash into each other in order to grow and stretch. It is a necessary part. And so in that inquiry and flow zone, we take those as givens and we just shape what that means. What does it look like for our team? How do we want it to feel? And so the best way to start with that learning zone is just simply by a good question and listening thoughtfully to that response. That always feels like a sneaky coach thing to say, but the power of just asking a question and hearing someone's answer is a far underutilized tool. So wanted to throw that one out. We're getting to the end here. We've got a little bit left to go, but we're moving toward closeout. So just to sum up some of these key takeaways on inclusive leadership and psychological safety. These are things that in part we know. Inclusive leadership and psychological safety go hand in hand. They are the things that empower teams to operate without or with less fear. They are the mechanisms and means to foster trust, to drive high performance, creativity, and to have a little bit of fun. And when leaders actively engage diverse perspectives, we ensure voices are heard at all levels and valued, and we create that experience and expectation of co-creation, that we're all showing up to bring our voices, to bring our ideas, to bring our opinions. And the third piece of that is owning the influence that we are bringing, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. And so being able to accept our narratives, to challenge them where they're not serving us, to recognize the impact we are having on our environment, not just our intention. And so it starts with an inside job, but it is one that we have to then work toward the outside as a collective, from inclusive leadership on the inside, and then over to the psychological safety community collective on the outside. And I love an acronym. If you do too, here's one that I use for when we do our psychological safety assessment as a team or as a group. We set some team agreements, and it's simply what I shall do on Monday. In this case, for this group, it's what I shall do tomorrow or Thursday. But it's really setting some team agreements. Here's some structures for that. We're working first to build awareness and measure progress. Maybe that's a survey, maybe that's some kind of, initial self-assessment exercise, maybe that's a team assessment exercise. We work and endeavor toward the learning zone. We practice empathy, we practice the connection, the learning, the building of a safe space for people to learn and engage, and that's the expectation. And then we leverage our unifying strengths. So what strengths are we bringing to the table? The flip side of that is, what challenges is our team bringing to the table? It's always a good one to dig into. And how do we want to unify our strengths to work on those challenges? And then clarifying expectations and commitments. This is really just making sure we have a checkpoint. What are we doing? How are we doing it? How do we want to measure it? How do we want to come back to it? So honoring these team agreements is not just something we do once and then we set them off, on the shelf over there and we never look at again. And then lastly, normalizing and modeling inquiry over advocacy. Many people, because psychological safety and lack thereof is such a visceral thing, particularly when we bring the intersectional lens of equity and inclusion and belonging, a lot of people come from an advocacy lens. Here's what I need. Here's what I'm not getting. Here's what I want. I don't like this. And that level of advocacy is necessary. There's a time and a place for it. But from a psychological safety co-creation building standpoint, this is where we really have to be mindful of our intention and our impact. And we have to ask ourselves, is what we are doing and how we're doing it getting us what we want? And with psychological safety, usually it comes back to this flipping advocacy over into inquiry and practicing asking questions and getting curious and being, committed to that learning zone, that learning process, that discussion and two-way conversation. And so one of our final reflection slides here, this is coming back to you and how your daily actions, your decisions can contribute to psychological safety. And again, from a coaching perspective, when we can do some visualizations, when we can put some clear tangibles down on paper for ourselves, we can get really honest and think about that intention versus impact. And the narrative that you share with your teams, how is that internal narrative coming outside? How are you taking your inside job to the collective? Are we gossiping? Are we striving for something different? Are we talking about hard things and accepting that there's going to be tension? Or are we making assumptions that their story is our story or our story can't align with their story? And finally, identifying one actionable change. Don't boil the ocean with your approach on this. Start with one thing. This is always a good one. Make it specific, make it measurable, make it actionable. You can set some SMART goals on that. But one actionable change that I always share with groups that I'm working with on psychological safety is this one very simple but complex piece. And that is practicing the act of listening and that inquiry mindset, which is to say, when somebody is sharing with you, if you can't relate to them, acknowledge and validate them. Somebody is sharing their perspective, their opinion, their belief. You may fundamentally disagree with it or have no reference for connection around that idea. But if you can't relate, just acknowledge and validate them. It's an old coaching tool that is, again, so important, because most of the time what happens when people come to share with us, we want to fix, we want to problem solve, we want to smooth things over, we want to feel better, we want them to feel better. And rarely in our places of connection do we have the opportunity for somebody to just hold space with us. And that's a really powerful connecting tool that, if you do one thing different for your leadership style and for thinking about being an inclusive leader, it would be that, to leave space for somebody to just share and be totally open to hearing their perspective without a need to respond. If you can't relate, just acknowledge and validate them. And so I'll leave you with this final piece. Psychological safety isn't a policy, it's a leadership practice. I have heard organizations say, we have a policy of psychological safety, and that can lead me to make a few assumptions and ask a few questions about, what does that mean? How do you practice it? How do you measure it? What does that look like? How would your team interpret it? How would somebody at a totally different level of leadership hierarchy, formal hierarchy or authority, measure it, talk about it, think about it? And what I would say on the final piece of that is that practice makes progress. It is not something that is fixed. It is something that is built over a long time, and it is something that can be easily broken and quickly broken. And so we take this constant learning posture, adapting posture, this ability to co-create these cultures together. And that's what psychological safety is. It's ongoing. And so that is what I have for you today. I know we just have a couple more minutes before the top of the hour here. And so I would love to hear, what barriers have you encountered in promoting psychological safety? Or how are you measuring psychological safety? How are you thinking about inclusive leadership on your teams? How are you upskilling? I would really welcome any shares. These are just some options for discussion prompts here. Okay, let's see here. And I think I'm a little behind on my chat. I know use of assessments can be great tools. How do you energize a team to participate in assessments when they are already complaining about survey fatigue? Great question. What I would say is, the survey experience is often one that creates this cycle of, here's the feedback, here's what we're feeling, and then people are waiting for an outcome and there's no outcome. And so they are waiting for somebody to drop in and be like, here's your solution, let me fix that for you. And in terms of this assessment and how I talk about this with teams, is really about co-creating. This is about, you all get to shape this. This is not something that upper level management's going to swoop in and drop this new benefit or this gift or this tool for you. This is about everybody getting involved. And so it's kind of a question of, who's willing and are you ready to roll up your sleeves together, rather than just share your opinion and your data, which is usually how surveys go, right? We want to hear people's sentiments. We want to hear what they're thinking, what their opinions are, but then that sets us up for this, like, other people creating the solution for us. And most humans don't really want other people's solutions. We want to make our own. So that's at least the way I approach it, is we're rolling up our sleeves together. We're co-creating this. We're focusing on our team's psychological safety party, not everybody else's. So that's what I would say to that. A difference between advocacy and inquiry. Yes. So advocacy would be stating what your opinion is, and it's more of a statement, whereas inquiry is a question. And that would be the kind of simplest way I could frame that up, is advocacy is really about you trying to assert your beliefs, your opinions, your wants, hopes, wishes, dreams. They may well be valid. There's a time and a place for them, but inquiry is a conversation opener. Whereas advocacy, if two people come together in advocacy, we meet in the middle, and then what? Where do we go from there? Whereas inquiry, we meet in the middle and then we see where we want to go, Do we go together? Do we have common ground? How can we work toward common ground? So it's a difference, a little bit of a difference in posture, and one is a statement, one's a question. Thank you for all these great questions in the chat and the kind words. Barriers are usually related to toxic positivity promoted by organizational leader. Absolutely. And what do we do with that, right? What do we do when upper level management, and again, I'm saying this a little bit facetiously, but also this is real, right? People over there in those offices are making decisions and having discussions that we're not part of. And oftentimes upper level management may be saying one thing, but modeling the behavior of another thing, right? And so those are the organizations that can be often say like, well, we have a policy of psychological safety and therefore you should feel safe, which just makes the person who's voicing lack of psychological safety feel like, you know, they're being gaslit in a system that's not for them. So there are power dynamics here. There is the opportunity for this toxic positivity or for this, for teams to kind of derail down the road of, you're the problem. If you're saying this isn't a psychologically safe place, you're the problem. And that is a whole different can of worms to open. And it is true in some places, right? I've worked with teams where they go on and on and on about all the things upper leadership is or isn't doing. And it's hard and it feels not great from a coach perspective to say, hey, what can we control? But that's the reality of the situation. That's the reality of the situation for most human things, right? We can't force others to change. We can control our sphere of influence and shape it. And that's what we try to focus down on. And it's hard. I've done this with people who are facing organizational layoffs, who upper level management is doing a lot of interesting and odd, demoralizing things for their folks. And it can be a mechanism for further disconnection if we just stay steeped in that what we can't control. This is meant to bring a little bit of that agency back to the team level. And that's why it's really about what's in the room of this shared space of people who are interdependent on each other to get their job done, not about this whole organizational system. Barriers, executive buy-in. Yep, this is the same thing that we were just talking about. But yeah, it's executive buy-in is a big one because they are often the purse strings, right? And there are different ways to approach this. Leadership upskilling, same way that if we have trouble with executive buy-in from a DEI front, what do we do with that? Well, we come at it from a different lens. How do we upskill leaders? How do we show this is going to promote engagement with my team? Why is this important to me? Thank you for bringing this up. I know it's a challenging one, and I appreciate that you say you see how this starts with you and your team. Sometimes that is the only thing that we have. We have a little bit of an island of safety here in a storm. Thank you so much for the kind words, everybody. I really appreciate it. Wow. I'm way behind in the chat now, but thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, thank
Melissa,
you,
will
thank
you
you.
be providing the slides? I think that was a question.
I am happy to share the notes format of the slides. If people would be willing to shoot me an email for that, I would be happy to share the notes, just like the slide deck itself, not my behind the scenes notes in there. There's a lot of messy stuff that I don't want to share with the world, but here's my email address. I'm happy to share. I also have a little question one pager that says, you know, what are some questions we can use to start conversations about psychological safety that I put together for the last time we did this with this group. And so I'm happy to share that too. And I do workshops, I do webinars on psychological safety. And I'm happy to talk about those with you too. I had a great engagement from an international team out of this conversation last time, and we put together a kind of customized webinar for their team and their industry lens, and we talked about that together. And then let me stop sharing real quick so I can pop something in the chat for you all. And I just want to say, please connect. I would love to hear from you one way or another, or just stay connected on LinkedIn. And if I can walk and talk at the same time here, here's my LinkedIn. And for those, discounted webinars, workshops, and things booked by the 18th, I am doing those in conjunction with my upcoming book and the pre-sale for my book. So here's where you can get more on that. And like I said, I'm going to do some special discounts just for folks that came to this presentation, folks that are part of the Institute for Diversity Certification, because I really do appreciate being in community with you all. I appreciate the thoughtfulness that all of you leaders bring to the spaces you're in and the really hard, challenging, complex things that you're working on in your workplaces and your communities. And I'm just so grateful to you for the energy that you bring to the spaces and for your continuing endeavors toward more equitable and inclusive spaces yourself. So thank you all. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your kind words. And until next time, I'm happy
Okay.
to stop recording here.
So if